On October 10, 732, an Umayyad lance found the gap in Charles Martel's shield wall, and the hammer of the Franks bled to death in the mud near Mousset. For 7 days the armies had skirmished in the wooded country between Tours and Poitiers, the Frankish infantry holding its tight square against the probing horsemen of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus. The Franks had come north from the Basilica of Saint Hilaire, which the raiders had stripped of its reliquaries, and Charles had chosen his ground carefully on the high timbered rise above the Vienne. But on the seventh morning the square bent, then buckled, and the cavalry poured through the seam. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. The death of Charles Martel at Tours would not be remembered as a single man's fall. It would be remembered as the moment an institution died, for what no one on that field could yet see was that the Carolingian machine, the entire scaffolding of a Christian Latin Europe, built on Frankish arms, had just been torn out at the roots. By nightfall, the Frankish host had broken into fragments fleeing north along the Roman roads. Charles's sons, Pepin and Carloman, still young men on the edge of adulthood, were bundled east by loyal retainers toward the Bavarian marches, where Duke Odilo held lands far from Umayyad reach. The Merovingian puppet king Theuderic IV, a figure of ceremony whose real power had always been held by the mayors of the palace, retreated to his estates and disappeared from the political record within months. Rival Frankish counts, long restive under the Arnulfing grip, now moved quickly. Some rode to al-Ghafiqi's camp at Poitiers to offer hostages and tribute. Others withdrew into fortified villas and waited to see which way the wind would blow. Duke Odo of Aquitaine, already broken by his defeat at the River Garonne that summer, negotiated a separate peace. His duchy would pay the jizya, retain its Christian worship, and govern its own countryside under Umayyad oversight. The cohesion of Francia, such as it was, dissolved in a single autumn. Within a generation, the map of Gaul had been redrawn. Umayyad governors, dispatched from Damascus by order of Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, established seats at Narbonne, Bordeaux, Tours, and Reims. They did not displace the local aristocracy so much as layer themselves atop it, ruling through Frankish and Gallo-Roman counts, who either converted to Islam and retained their estates in full, or remained Christian and paid the poll tax on their peasants. Mosques rose in the old Roman civitates, often beside the surviving basilicas rather than in place of them, as both faiths drew on the same quarries and the same tax rolls. Trade routes that had atrophied in the 7th century reopened. Cordoban silver moved north along the Loire, and Frisian amber moved south toward Al-Andalus. It was not conquest in the sense the old Romans would have recognized. It was absorption. But what few yet understood was how this political reorganization would unmake the spiritual center of the Latin West and send the successor of St. Peter into exile across the sea. In Rome, Pope Gregory III had spent the last year of Charles Martel's life pleading for Frankish protection against the Lombard king Liutprand, who was methodically absorbing the Byzantine Exarchate and pressing toward the walls of the Holy City. With the Franks gone, that protection never came. Gregory's successor, Zachary, inherited a papacy with no army to call upon and no patron within reach. Byzantium, its attention fixed on the Arab frontier and the iconoclast controversies of Constantinople, could spare nothing for Italy. When Liutprand's successors finally marched on Rome in the 750s, the papal court made the decision no pope had ever made before. They would not submit to Lombard terms, and they would not accept Umayyad tributary status as the Aquitanians had. They would leave. Relics were packed into lead-lined chests. The Lateran archives were loaded onto Neapolitan galleys. The Bishop of Rome sailed west, past the Pillars of Hercules, toward the only major Latin Christian polity still ruled by kings who owed nothing to Damascus. The papal fleet made landfall in the harbors of the Uí and the High King Flaithbertach Mac Loingsig's successors received the Roman exiles at Armagh with the full honor due to the heirs of Peter. Ireland in the middle 8th century was already the intellectual heart of the northern world, with monastic centres at Iona, Clonmacnoise, and Kildare producing scholars whose Latin was as refined as anything in Gaul. Now those scriptoria received the Lateran archives themselves, Latin liturgy fused with Gaelic monastic practice in ways no one had planned. The Roman Computus met the Irish Paschal tables, and, after a generation of argument, a hybrid emerged. The papacy continued to issue bulls and appoint bishops, but from Armagh rather than from the Tiber. Pilgrims who had once walked the road to Rome now sailed the cold waters to Ulster. The successor of Peter spoke Latin still, but he heard Gaelic in the cloister, and he looked out on Atlantic fog rather than Roman ruin. No Charlemagne rose from the scattered Arnulfing line. No imperial coronation took place on Christmas Day of the year 800, because there was no empire to crown and no pope in Rome to do the crowning. The court school at Aachen, the summoning of Alcuin from York, the standardization of the script we would have called Carolingian minuscule, none of it occurred. Classical manuscripts continued to decay in isolated scriptoria across Gaul and northern Italy, copied irregularly by monks who lacked both royal patronage and a unified curriculum. Many texts that had survived the 6th century did not survive the 9th. Livy thinned further. Tacitus dwindled to fragments. The works that did endure tended to be preserved in two very different places: the Irish monasteries that had taken in the papal libraries, and the Umayyad cities of the south, where Cordoban scholars translated Latin into Arabic alongside their Greek labors. The Latin West was not extinguished. It was simply decentralized into forms that would have astonished anyone who remembered the old Rome. East of the Rhine, the collapse of Frankish arms had consequences that no one in Damascus had planned for. The Saxon and Frisian chieftains, who in the true timeline would have been ground down across 3 brutal generations by Charlemagne's campaigns, remained pagan and remained free. They raided the Christian enclaves of the Rhineland with growing confidence, burning the mission stations that St. Boniface had planted at Fulda and Fritzlar. Boniface himself, cut off from Frankish protection, continued his work with a stubbornness that his biographers would later call holy. He was killed near Dockham by Frisian raiders, as he was in our own history, but this time no Carolingian punitive expedition followed. His mission died with him. The Germanic frontier stabilized as a pagan world, trading with the Christian south, but not absorbed by it, and the line of the Rhine became what the Danube had been in the age of Marcus Aurelius, a negotiated border, not a civilizational seam. By the year 1000, Córdoba stood as the largest city in the Latin West, its libraries dwarfing anything north of the Pyrenees, its scholars moving freely along the river roads from Toledo to Tours and from Seville to Rheims. Christian and Muslim jurists in the Gallic Emirates argued Roman law in mixed courts. The papacy at Armagh sent legates across the Irish Sea to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and, more rarely, to the German marches. No one spoke any longer of a Christian Roman emperor because the idea had no institutional home. It had lived in our own timeline because Charlemagne gave it one. In this one, the Frankish infantry square broke on a wooded rise above the Vienne, and the man who would have been called the Hammer was buried where he fell. Empires do not rest on single battles, but on the institutions that battles permit or forbid. Tours was such a permission, and when it was withdrawn, the shape of everything that followed, the languages, the liturgies, the libraries, the very idea of a unified Christian West took a form no one in Damascus or Armagh or Aachen had designed, but which all of them in the end had to live within.